Today, we're doing a deep dive into the theories of Mauro Biglino. He's got this idea that the Elohim in the Bible, well, they weren't God as we traditionally understand it. Instead, he suggests they were extraterrestrials with advanced technology. Our main source for this is an article from the Spiritual Seek that breaks down his arguments, how he approaches the text, and the evidence he uses. Biglino's background is pretty unique for this kind of theory. He was a religious text translator, working for a Catholic publishing house, no less, so he's got a deep understanding of the Masoretic Text in ancient Hebrew, which informs his approach. So rather than looking for deeper symbolic meanings or relying on traditional theological interpretations, he's focused on what he calls the plain meaning of the original Hebrew.
Right, and that leads him to his main argument that the Elohim were not a single divine being, but extraterrestrials.
So how does he get there?
He starts with the word Elohim itself. The fact it's plural in Hebrew suggests multiple beings, and when you look at the actions attributed to them, he argues they're not consistent with the traditional view of an all-powerful singular God.
And that's where the ancient astronaut theory comes in, the idea that extraterrestrials interacted with humans in the past and were seen as gods.
Exactly. Biglino's interpretation fits right into that. He sees the Elohim as physical beings with technology far beyond what ancient humans could comprehend, which made their actions seem miraculous.
And this emphasis on the physicality of the Elohim is key for him.
Absolutely. The Bible describes them as having bodies, interacting with humans directly, even eating and drinking, which clashes with the traditional concept of God as a purely spiritual being.
He also points to certain biblical events as evidence of advanced technology rather than divine intervention.
Like the parting of the Red Sea, for example.
Which he sees as a technological feat rather than a miracle.
Right. Another big part of his theory is the idea of genetic manipulation. He points to the creation story in Genesis, where it says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." The plural language there is important to him.
So he's suggesting the Elohim were involved in some kind of genetic engineering.
That's his interpretation. Maybe they manipulated existing hominins or created humans entirely.
That's a pretty radical departure from the traditional understanding of creation.
It is. And he goes further. He points out the conflicts and territorial disputes described among the Elohim. These, he says, don't fit with the idea of a unified, all-loving God.
More like different groups of advanced beings vying for power.
Exactly. Another interesting point is Biglino's claim that the Old Testament, when read literally, doesn't really talk about an afterlife or spiritual development. It's focused on earthly life and how humans interacted with the Elohim.
So he sees concepts like the soul, heaven, and hell as later additions.
That's his suggestion, yes. To back up his claims, Biglino uses specific passages from the Bible. One of them is Genesis 1.26:27, the verse about creating humans in our image. He focuses on those plural pronouns.
But traditional interpretations explain that as God speaking in the plural of majesty, or maybe referring to a heavenly court, and then in the next verse it uses he to refer to God.
Right, those are the traditional counter-arguments. But Biglino also points to Genesis 3.22, where God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil."
Again, suggesting a plural divine council.
Exactly. Traditional interpretations say this could be God speaking to angels or simply deliberating with himself. Another key passage for Biglino is Genesis 6.1-4, the story of the sons of God mating with human women and producing the Nephilim.
That one's always been open to a lot of different interpretations.
For sure. Biglino sees it as evidence of the Elohim engaging in genetic experiments or even interbreeding with humans. Traditional interpretations are more varied, seeing the sons of God as fallen angels, righteous descendants of Seth, or just powerful human rulers.
Biglino also uses Exodus 24.9-11, where Moses and the elders see the God of Israel standing on something described as a paved work of sapphire stone.
He interprets that as some kind of technological platform, like a landing pad. Traditional interpretations, of course, see it as a symbolic representation of God's presence.
Then there's Ezekiel's vision of the chariot in Ezekiel 1, this complex machine with wheels within wheels and winged creatures.
Biglino jumps on that as a description of a spacecraft, but traditional interpretations view it as a symbolic vision of God's glory and power. The wheels represent God's omnipresence, and the creatures are his attendants.
So how does all of this compare to what other ancient astronaut theorists like Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin have proposed?
Well, von Däniken, in his book Chariots of the Gods, focused more on archaeological evidence and interpretations of ancient artwork to argue for extraterrestrial influence. Biglino's approach is different. He's all about the textual analysis of the Hebrew Bible.
And Sitchin.
Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series looked at Sumerian cuneiform texts, arguing that they describe a planet called Nibiru and its inhabitants, the Anunnaki, who came to Earth and created humans. Both Biglino and Sitchin are dealing with ancient texts and extraterrestrial intervention, but focus on different cultures and languages. Plus, Sitchin throws in this whole hypothetical planet, while Biglino sticks to what's in the Bible.
So, Biglino's theories are bound to be controversial. What are some of the criticisms he faces?
One of the biggest criticisms is his strictly literal approach. Scholars argue that he ignores the literary, cultural, and historical context of the Bible, like the use of metaphors, symbolism, and poetic language common in ancient texts.
And they also accuse him of cherry-picking evidence to fit his theory.
Right. Selective interpretation and confirmation bias are common criticisms. There are linguistic disputes as well. Scholars challenge his translations of certain Hebrew words and grammatical structures, saying they're not always accurate.
His work hasn't been peer-reviewed either, which raises questions about its academic validity.
And then there's the whole association with pseudoscience. Critics point out the similarities between his theories and ideas like the ancient astronaut theory, which lack empirical evidence.
They argue he's imposing modern concepts onto ancient texts, like interpreting ancient weapons as lasers.
Exactly. Anachronisms are a common criticism.
But how does Biglino respond to all this?
He defends his methodology by emphasizing his commitment to a literal reading of the original Hebrew. He argues that he's simply presenting the plain meaning of the words without any theological or dogmatic bias.
So he's saying, don't shoot the messenger.
Basically, he acknowledges that his theories are controversial, but insists they're grounded in linguistic analysis and the text itself.
He's not trying to disprove God or undermine faith, but simply offer a different perspective, one that he believes is more accurate to the original text.
He sees it as an invitation to re-examine the Bible with a fresh perspective, free from traditional interpretations.
So, if we entertain Biglino's theories, even for a moment, what are the potential implications?
They're pretty significant. If his ideas were widely accepted, it would fundamentally challenge our understanding of God as a transcendent, omnipotent, and spiritual being.
It would redefine monotheism.
Potentially, it could lead to a view of henotheism, worshiping one God among many, or even a return to polytheistic beliefs.
And what about the creation story?
The idea of creation as a divine act would be replaced by genetic manipulation or intervention by extraterrestrial beings.
That would dramatically alter our understanding of human origins and our place in the universe. The idea of being created in God's image would take on a literal, physical meaning rather than a spiritual or metaphorical one.
The Bible's status as divinely inspired and inerrant would also come into question.
If it's just a historical record of interactions with extraterrestrials, its religious authority would be seriously undermined.
This would have ripple effects on religious doctrine and practice. Core doctrines based on traditional interpretations would need to be reevaluated.
Concepts like miracles, prophecy, and divine revelation would be seen through a technological lens.
And it's not just religion. Biglino's theories could impact secular and scientific worldviews as well.
It offers an alternative explanation for religious narratives that might resonate with those who are skeptical of traditional beliefs.
It's important to put Biglino's work in context. It's part of a larger body of thought that includes ancient astronaut theories, alternative history, and pseudo-archaeology.
These all share the idea that extraterrestrials visited Earth in the past and influenced ancient civilizations.
And that ancient monuments and artifacts were built with their help, explaining their advanced engineering and complexity. They see ancient myths and legends as accounts of actual encounters with extraterrestrials.
These theories challenge mainstream historical and archaeological interpretations by offering alternative explanations for unexplained phenomena.
But it's crucial to approach all of this with critical thinking. While intriguing, these theories often lack empirical evidence and rely on selective interpretations of data.
We need to consider multiple perspectives and engage with scholarly discourse.
Absolutely. We need to hold these claims to a high standard of scrutiny.
So while Biglino's work has its critics, it's undoubtedly had an impact.
He's definitely popularized alternative interpretations of the Bible and sparked public debate. He's also fueled interest in ancient astronaut theories, alternative history, and the search for ancient mysteries.
In a way, he's encouraged critical thinking by making people question established narratives and explore different viewpoints.
His work has opened up new conversations about the nature of interpretation, the role of religion, and the relationship between science and religion.
To recap, Mauro Biglino's reinterpretation of the Hebrew Bible as a record of extraterrestrial encounters has generated a lot of discussion.
His claims about the Elohim have resonated with some while facing criticism from others. His strictly literal methodology is both his strength and weakness.
The potential implications of his theories are far-reaching, potentially impacting religious doctrine, our understanding of human origins, and the authority of Scripture.
While the validity of his conclusions remains contested, there's no denying that his work has sparked public interest in alternative interpretations of the past and encouraged critical engagement with established narratives. His legacy lies in his ability to provoke thought, challenge conventional wisdom, and inspire continued exploration of the complex intersection of religion, science, history, and our search for meaning.
Ultimately, it's about approaching these claims with a balanced perspective, considering both the supporting arguments and the counter-arguments.
And that leads us to a crucial question. What if, for a moment, we entertain the idea that the Bible could be a record of encounters with extraterrestrials? How would that change our understanding of religion and spirituality?
And how would it impact our perception of humanity's place in the cosmos? These are questions worth pondering.
Biglino's approach really does make you think about how many ways you can interpret these ancient texts.
Yeah, it does. He definitely highlights how subjective translation can be and how the cultural context of a text plays such a huge role in how we understand it.
Even when you think you're just choosing a simple word, there are so many subtle shades of meaning that can creep in. And with ancient languages, where the culture is so different from our own, the chances of misunderstanding something are even higher.
So, Biglino's insistence on a strictly literal reading of the Hebrew really stands out, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like he's saying, let's just peel back all the layers of interpretation that have been added over the centuries and see what the text actually says, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, you have to admit it's a pretty bold approach.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, if we were to apply that same level of literalism to other ancient texts, what might we find? Could we uncover hidden meanings that challenge our current understanding of history and religion?
That's a pretty fascinating thought, isn't it?
It is. It speaks to the power of language and how important it is to think critically about what we're reading.
We need to be aware of our own biases and assumptions when we interpret any text, especially text from ancient cultures.
We have to be willing to question everything we think we know and consider alternative perspectives, even the ones that seem a little strange at first.
Who knows, maybe we'll stumble upon something that completely changes how we see the world.
Now let's talk about some of the pushback against Biglino's work. There's been a lot of controversy, as you might expect.
A lot of the criticism comes from his literalist approach, with scholars saying he ignores the literary and historical context of the Bible.
They argue that ancient texts are often full of symbolism, allegory, and poetic language, which you can't just translate word for word.
And they say he picks and chooses verses that support his theory, while ignoring ones that don't.
Right, that idea of selective interpretation, confirmation bias, it comes up a lot. There are also issues with his understanding of the Hebrew language itself.
Some scholars have questioned the accuracy of his translations and interpretations of specific words and grammatical structures.
They say he sometimes stretches the meaning of words to fit his theory. And then there's the fact that his work hasn't been peer-reviewed, which raises concerns about its academic credibility.
And there's the link to pseudoscience that critics bring up. They say his theories are too close to fringe ideas, like the ancient astronaut theory, which doesn't have much scientific backing.
They accuse him of historical anachronism, too, basically imposing modern concepts onto ancient texts.
Like saying those powerful weapons described in the Bible were actually lasers or something.
Exactly. Those are some pretty strong criticisms.
To be fair, Biglino does have responses to these criticisms. He defends his literalist method, saying it's the most objective way to understand the text.
He insists that he's not trying to push his own agenda, but rather just letting the text speak for itself. He knows his work is controversial, but he maintains that his interpretations are based on linguistic analysis and textual evidence.
He stresses that he's not out to disprove God or undermine faith. He just wants to offer a different perspective on the Bible, one that he thinks is closer to the original meaning.
He's basically encouraging people to approach the Bible with fresh eyes, to consider the possibility that its true meaning has been lost under centuries of traditional interpretation.
So, even if you don't agree with all of Biglino's ideas, It's clear that he's started an important conversation about how we interpret the Bible.
He's making us question our assumptions and grapple with the difficulties of translating and understanding ancient texts.
And he's reminding us that history isn't always as straightforward as we might think.
There are often multiple ways to interpret the same events, and we have to do the work of weighing the evidence and coming to our own conclusions.
And sometimes those conclusions might challenge some deeply held beliefs.
But that's the beauty of exploring ideas, isn't it? It can take us to unexpected places and make us confront things that might be uncomfortable.
But ultimately, I think it helps us understand the world and our place in it a little better. Even if we don't fully buy into Biglino's theories, we can appreciate the questions he's asking and the discussions he's sparking.
That's the real value of this deep dive, I think.
Now, before we wrap up our discussion of Biglino, I think it's important to take a step back and look at his work within a larger cultural context.
We've talked about how his theories fit into this broader category of ancient astronaut theories, which haven't exactly been embraced by mainstream academia, but have captured the imagination of a lot of people.
These theories, like the ones popularized by Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin, really tap into our sense of wonder about the past.
They make us think about the possibility that our ancient ancestors might have had contact with beings from other worlds, and they offer different explanations for things that are hard to explain using conventional science or history.
Like, how did ancient people build massive structures like the pyramids or Stonehenge?
Ancient astronaut theorists would say they had help from extraterrestrials with advanced technology.
Or what about all those ancient myths and legends that talk about gods or other beings coming down from the sky?
Ancient astronaut theorists interpret those stories as accounts of real encounters with extraterrestrials.
Now, it's important to acknowledge that there's no real scientific evidence to support these claims.
A lot of the arguments made by ancient astronaut theorists are based on speculation, conjecture, and choosing evidence that fits their theory.
But even so, these theories continue to intrigue people and generate a lot of debate.
I think they speak to a very basic human desire to understand our place in the universe and to consider the possibility that we're not alone.
And they challenge us to question the accepted stories we've been told about the past.
Even if we don't agree with everything Biglino says or with the broader claims of ancient astronaut theories, I think it's important to be willing to question those established narratives and explore different viewpoints.
It's that kind of curiosity that drives progress and helps us understand the world better.
Exactly. And it's what makes studying history, religion, and science so endlessly fascinating.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Mauro Biglino's theories, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, to read different perspectives, to think critically, and to come to your own conclusions. That's a good point. It's about staying curious and open to new ways of thinking.
Biglino's work, even if you don't buy into the whole ancient astronaut theory, forces us to rethink how we understand the past.
His theories highlight just how fascinated we are by the things we can't explain, and that search for meaning in our lives.
Whether you agree with him or not, he raises questions that make you think critically about the stories we tell ourselves about history and religion.
In the end, I think Biglino's biggest contribution is that he's sparked all these conversations and made people look at ancient texts in a new light.
He reminds us that we should never stop questioning and learning, and that new discoveries are always possible.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Mauro Biglino's theories, we encourage you to keep digging into these topics, read different viewpoints, think for yourself, and draw your own conclusions.
Remember to approach these topics with a critical eye. Stay curious, keep an open mind, and never stop searching for knowledge.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and often controversial world of ancient astronaut theories.